The crystal chandelier above my head sparkled like 1,000 tiny stars as I dusted each piece carefully, knowing that one wrong move could cost me more than my monthly rent. I'd been cleaning the penthouse suite at the Grand Riverside Hotel for 3 years, invisible to the wealthy guests who treated me like living furniture. But today felt different. Today, whispers followed me down the marble corridors, and curious glances tracked my every movement. Little did I know that in less than 24 hours, I'd discover why the staff had been acting so strangely, and my entire world would shatter and rebuild in ways I never imagined possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My alarm buzzed at 5:30 in the morning, same as it had every day for the past 3 years. I rolled out of my narrow bed in the studio apartment I could barely afford, even with my full-time job at the Grand Riverside Hotel. The water in my shower ran lukewarm at best, but I'd learned to make do with less than most people considered basic necessities. Growing up in foster care teaches you that comfort is temporary and independence is everything. Grace Thompson had been my final foster mother, taking me in when I was 16 and everyone else had given up on finding me a permanent placement. She was the closest thing to family I'd ever known, though even she couldn't fill the void left by never knowing who my real parents were. The state had told me my mother died in childbirth and my father was unknown, listed simply as information unavailable on every document I'd ever seen. I pulled on my crisp white uniform shirt and black slacks, tying my dark hair back in the neat bun required by hotel policy. My reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror showed tired eyes and pale skin, the result of working double shifts whenever possible to save money for the community college classes I took 3 nights a week. Business administration wasn't glamorous, but it was practical, and I'd learned early that dreams without practical foundations crumble fast. The bus ride to the Grand Riverside took 40 minutes through Connecticut's winding roads, past manicured lawns and iron gates that protected estates I'd only seen from a distance. The hotel itself was a monument to old money, built in the 1920s when robber barons wanted a place to retreat from New York City without sacrificing luxury. Its red brick facade and white columns spoke of permanence and tradition, everything my life had always lacked. Maria Santos, the head of housekeeping, greeted me with her usual warm smile as I clocked in. She was one of the few people at the hotel who saw me as more than just another employee, often asking about my classes and encouraging my ambitions. Today, though, her smile seemed forced, and she kept glancing toward the front desk where the manager, Mr. Peterson, was engaged in hushed conversation with several other staff members. The morning routine began like any other. I loaded my cart with fresh linens, towels, and cleaning supplies, checking the guest list for special requests or VIP arrivals. Room 412 needed extra attention, a regular guest who always left generous tips. The executive suites on the top floor required the delicate touch that had earned me recognition among the management staff. I took pride in my work, even if others might see it as menial. But as I moved through the hotel's elegant corridors, something felt off. Conversations stopped when I approached, and I caught fragments of whispered discussions that seemed to center around me. Mrs. Patterson from the concierge desk kept staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Even the kitchen staff, usually friendly and chatty, fell silent when I passed through to restock my supplies. The strangest moment came when I was cleaning the mirror in the executive lounge. Mr. Peterson appeared behind me, studying my reflection with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. He muttered something under his breath that sounded like remarkable resemblance, before catching himself and quickly walking away. I stared at my own image, wondering what he could possibly see that I didn't. During my lunch break, I sat in the employee break room with Sandra, one of the other housekeepers who'd become a friend over the years. She was unusually quiet, picking at her sandwich without her typical stream of gossip about the guests and their eccentricities. When I asked if something was wrong, she just shook her head and said everything was fine, but her eyes told a different story. The afternoon brought news that would explain the morning's strange behavior. Mr. Peterson called an emergency staff meeting in the main conference room, something that had never happened in my 3 years at the hotel. The entire housekeeping staff, along with front desk personnel and management, gathered around the polished mahogany table that had hosted countless business meetings and social events. Mr. Peterson's face was grave as he addressed us, his hands clasped behind his back in the formal posture he reserved for serious announcements. He explained that Robert Whitman, one of the hotel's most prominent long-term guests and a pillar of the Riverside community, had passed away peacefully in his sleep the night before. The news hit me harder than I expected. Mr. Whitman had been staying in the penthouse suite every few months as long as I'd worked there, always polite and respectful to the staff. What made the announcement even more unusual was Mr. Peterson's next statement. He explained that Mr. Whitman's attorney had specifically requested the presence of all hotel staff at the reading of the will, which would take place the following afternoon at the Riverside Community Center. This was unprecedented, and the confusion on everyone's faces reflected my own bewilderment. Why would a wealthy businessman include hotel employees in his final wishes? The rest of my shift passed in a haze of speculation and uncertainty. Mr. Whitman had never been particularly social with the staff, though he was always courteous and tipped well. He was known throughout Riverside as a successful businessman who'd built a construction and real estate empire worth tens of millions of dollars. His family was prominent in local society circles, frequent subjects of the town's social pages and charity event coverage. I remembered seeing his wife, Victoria Whitman, during some of his stays. She was an elegant woman in her mid-50s, always impeccably dressed and carrying herself with the confidence that comes from a lifetime of privilege. Their adult children occasionally visited as well, Marcus and Julia, both successful in their own right and clearly accustomed to the finer things in life. They belonged to a world so far removed from mine that our paths crossing felt almost surreal.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That evening, I called Grace to tell her about the strange day and the upcoming will reading. Her voice carried a note of concern that surprised me, though she insisted it was probably just a generous gesture from a man who appreciated good service. She offered to accompany me to the reading, but I declined, not wanting to involve her in what was likely to be an awkward situation where I'd be completely out of place among the Whitman family and their social circle. Sleep came fitfully that night, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. I found myself thinking about Mr. Whitman's visits to the hotel, trying to remember if there had been any signs or clues about why he might remember the staff in his will. He'd always been observant, often commenting on the quality of service and the attention to detail that made the Grand Riverside special. Perhaps he simply wanted to show appreciation for the people who'd made his stays comfortable over the years. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, matching my uncertain mood as I prepared for what would surely be one of the most unusual days of my life. I chose my best dress, a simple navy blue outfit I'd bought for job interviews and special occasions, wanting to show respect for Mr. Whitman's memory and the solemnity of the occasion. The community center was only a few blocks from the hotel, but the walk felt like miles as I contemplated what lay ahead. The Riverside Community Center was buzzing with activity when I arrived, its parking lot filled with expensive cars that reflected the wealth and status of the Whitman family's circle. I recognized several faces from local newspaper society pages, including business associates and family friends who'd known Robert Whitman for decades. The hotel staff had gathered near the entrance, looking as uncertain and out of place as I felt. Inside, the main hall had been arranged with rows of folding chairs facing a simple podium where David Chen, the Whitman family attorney, was organizing his papers and speaking quietly with Victoria Whitman. She looked elegant in her black designer suit, her silver hair styled perfectly despite the circumstances. Marcus and Julia Whitman sat in the front row, both dressed appropriately for the formal occasion, their expressions reflecting the gravity of the moment.
Victoria Whitman's eyes swept across the assembled crowd, lingering on the hotel staff with what I interpreted as mild confusion. She leaned toward her attorney, gesturing in our direction, and I caught fragments of their conversation. Her voice carried clearly across the room as she questioned why those people needed to be present for what should have been a private family matter. Mr. Chen's response was too quiet to hear, but his gestures suggested he was explaining legal requirements or specific provisions in the will. Marcus Whitman turned to survey the room, his gaze stopping on me with unmistakable curiosity. He said something to his sister Julia, who also turned to look in my direction. Their expressions weren't hostile, but there was definitely something calculating in their assessment. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, wondering if my presence was somehow inappropriate or if I'd misunderstood the invitation to attend. Mr. Chen approached the podium and called the gathering to order, his professional demeanor commanding immediate attention from the diverse group assembled before him. He began with standard legal formalities, expressing condolences to the family and outlining the purpose of the gathering. Robert Whitman's will, he explained, contained several unusual provisions that required explanation in the presence of all named beneficiaries and interested parties. The initial bequests were straightforward and expected. Substantial sums went to various charities that Mr. Whitman had supported throughout his life, including the local hospital, several educational foundations, and organizations focused on helping disadvantaged youth. Victoria Whitman would receive the family home and a significant portion of the liquid assets, ensuring her comfortable lifestyle could continue unchanged. Marcus would inherit the construction business that had been the foundation of the family fortune. Julia received several investment properties and a trust fund that would provide generous income for life. These distributions drew approving nods from the family members who seemed satisfied with their expected inheritances. The attorney's voice remained steady and professional as he worked through the document's provisions, but I noticed his hands were slightly trembling as he approached what was clearly the most significant section of the will. Then came the moment that would change everything I thought I knew about my life and identity. Mr. Chen's voice grew more serious as he announced that the bulk of Robert Whitman's estate, including the controlling interest in Whitman Industries and the majority of his personal wealth, would go to his daughter. The family members nodded, assuming this referred to Julia, but the attorney's next words sent shockwaves through the room. He called my name, Emma Collins, and asked me to stand. The room fell completely silent as confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Victoria Whitman's face went pale while Marcus and Julia exchanged looks of complete bewilderment. I felt frozen in place, certain there had been some terrible mistake, but Mr. Chen continued reading from the will with unwavering professionalism. Robert Whitman's words, as recorded in his final testament, explained that Emma Collins was his biological daughter, born from a relationship he had 23 years ago. He acknowledged that he never claimed paternity publicly or established a relationship with me, but he'd followed my life from a distance, ensuring I was safe and cared for through anonymous contributions to my foster care and educational expenses. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, my legs suddenly unsteady as the implications washed over me. The man I'd served tea and cleaned rooms for was my father, a connection I'd never suspected despite years of brief interactions. The silence in the room was deafening as everyone processed this unexpected twist, but it was quickly broken by Victoria Whitman's sharp voice. She stood abruptly, her composure cracking as she pointed an accusing finger in my direction. Her voice carried clearly across the room as she declared that this was impossible, that I had no right to any part of her husband's legacy. She insisted that Robert would never have betrayed their marriage or hidden such a significant secret from his family. Her children quickly joined her protests, their voices rising in indignation and disbelief. Marcus Whitman's face had turned red with anger as he demanded proof of these outrageous claims. He suggested that I had somehow manipulated his father or that the will had been forged by someone seeking to defraud the family. Julia was equally vocal in her objections.
pointing out that I was nothing more than a hotel employee with no legitimate claim to their father's fortune. Their words cut deep, but I was still too shocked to respond or defend myself. Mr. Chen raised his hand for silence, his professional authority gradually restoring order to the chaotic scene. He explained that Robert Whitman had anticipated these reactions and had provided extensive documentation to support his claims. DNA test results, conducted without my knowledge during one of my routine medical checkups that had been paid for by an anonymous benefactor, conclusively proved paternity. Hospital records from my birth 23 years earlier corroborated the timeline and circumstances described in the will. The attorney also revealed that Robert Whitman had maintained detailed records of his anonymous support throughout my childhood and adolescence. School fees, medical expenses, and even my current community college tuition had all been paid through a trust fund he'd established specifically for my benefit. The paper trail was extensive and legally sound, leaving no doubt about the authenticity of his claims or the validity of my inheritance. Victoria Whitman's shock quickly transformed into barely controlled rage as she realized the implications of this revelation. She accused me of seducing her husband for financial gain, despite the obvious impossibility of such claims given my age and the timeline involved. Her voice grew shrill as she insisted that I was an opportunistic gold digger who had somehow discovered the family's wealth and manipulated the situation to my advantage. The hotel staff, who had remained silent throughout the dramatic revelations, began to murmur among themselves as they processed what they'd witnessed. Several of them were staring at me with new understanding, perhaps recognizing facial features or mannerisms they'd subconsciously noted over the years. Mr. Peterson approached me carefully, his expression mixing surprise with something that might have been pride in having employed someone connected to one of the area's most prominent families. Mr. Chen continued reading from the will, explaining that Robert Whitman had left specific instructions for managing the transition of his business interests to ensure minimal disruption to operations and employee welfare. He'd also established a separate trust fund to provide ongoing support for Victoria, Marcus, and Julia, ensuring they would remain financially secure despite the majority of the estate going to me. These provisions showed careful planning and consideration for all family members, even as he acknowledged his previously hidden daughter. The legal documentation was overwhelming in its thoroughness and attention to detail. Robert Whitman had clearly spent considerable time preparing for this moment, anticipating the family's reaction and taking steps to protect both his legitimate heirs and the daughter he'd never publicly acknowledged. Medical records, financial documents, and even photographs taken without my knowledge over the years created an undeniable picture of paternal involvement and care. As the initial shock began to wear off, I found my voice for the first time since the reading began. I stood slowly, my hands shaking as I addressed the room and particularly the Whitman family members who were still staring at me with hostility and disbelief. I explained that I'd had no knowledge of my father's identity and had never sought to profit from any family connections. My presence at the hotel had been purely coincidental, a result of needing employment and having the necessary skills for housekeeping work. My words seemed to carry little weight with Victoria, Marcus, and Julia, who remained convinced that I was somehow responsible for orchestrating the situation. They huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers with their own attorney, clearly planning to challenge the will's provisions and my legitimacy as an heir. Their hostility was palpable, and I realized that accepting this inheritance would mean entering into a prolonged legal battle with people who had every reason to see me as a threat to their own interests. The reading concluded with Mr. Chen explaining the next steps in the legal process and providing contact information for questions or concerns. He approached me privately after most of the crowd had dispersed, offering to schedule a meeting where we could discuss the practical implications of my inheritance
and the responsibilities that would come with managing such substantial assets. His demeanor was professional but kind, recognizing the overwhelming nature of the situation I was facing. Grace Thompson appeared at my side as the community center began to empty, having arrived despite my earlier insistence that she didn't need to attend. Her presence provided the emotional support I desperately needed as the reality of the situation continued to sink in. She wrapped her arms around me as tears finally came, the result of shock, grief for a father I'd never known I had, and uncertainty about what this revelation would mean for my future. The drive home passed in contemplative silence, both Grace and I processing the extraordinary events of the afternoon. The modest apartment I'd called home for the past few years suddenly felt different, knowing that I was now technically one of the wealthiest people in Riverside. But wealth felt abstract and surreal compared to the immediate emotional impact of learning my father's identity and realizing he'd been watching over me throughout my life without my knowledge. That evening, alone in my apartment, I sat at my small kitchen table reviewing the documents Mr. Chen had provided. Copies of DNA test results, financial records, and legal papers created a paper trail of my father's secret involvement in my life. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but it raised as many questions as it answered about his motivations and the choices he'd made over the years. Part 2. Control Dynamics. The phone started ringing at 6 in the morning, jarring me from the restless sleep I had finally managed to find. Victoria Whitman's voice was ice-cold through the receiver, her words clipped and precise as she informed me that the family would be contesting the will on grounds of fraud and undue influence. She suggested, in a tone that barely concealed her contempt, that it would be in my best interest to renounce any claim to the inheritance and return to my appropriate station in life. Before I could respond, she continued with what she called a generous offer. The family would provide me with $50,000 as a settlement, enough to finish my education and start a modest life somewhere far from Riverside. In exchange, I would sign documents disclaiming any relationship to Robert Whitman and agreeing to never use the Whitman name or discuss the circumstances of my birth. Her voice carried the authority of someone used to getting their way, and without question had managed to locate my phone number quickly.
Accustomed to having her demands met without question, I hung up without answering, my hands trembling as the reality of what I was facing began to crystallize. This wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was about identity, belonging, and the right to claim my place in a family that saw me as an intruder. Victoria's offer was designed to make me disappear quietly, to erase the inconvenient truth of my existence and preserve the carefully constructed image of Whitman family respectability. Within an hour, Marcus Whitman appeared at my apartment door, his expensive suit and confident demeanor a stark contrast to my modest surroundings. He examined my living space with barely concealed disdain, his eyes taking in the secondhand furniture and threadbare carpet as if they confirmed his assumptions about my character and motivations. His presence filled my small apartment, making me acutely aware of the vast differences in our backgrounds and circumstances. Marcus's approach was more sophisticated than his mother's direct threats, but no less manipulative in its intent. He spoke about family responsibility and the importance of protecting Robert Whitman's legacy from scandal and controversy. He painted himself as the reasonable voice in a difficult situation, someone who understood that I'd been thrust into circumstances beyond my control, but who also recognized the practical realities of the situation. He explained that managing Whitman Industries required years of experience and specialized knowledge that I simply didn't possess. The business employed hundreds of people whose livelihoods depended on stable leadership and continuity. By insisting on my inheritance rights, I would be jeopardizing not just the family's financial security, but the welfare of countless employees and their families. His argument was carefully crafted to make me feel selfish and irresponsible for claiming what was legally mine. The psychological pressure was intense and carefully orchestrated. Marcus presented himself as someone who genuinely cared about my welfare and future prospects, suggesting that inheriting such wealth would make me a target for fortune hunters and opportunists who would never accept me for who I truly was.
He warned that the burden of managing vast wealth would consume my life and prevent me from pursuing the education and career goals I'd worked so hard to achieve. His final argument centered on family unity and the importance of honoring Robert Whitman's memory in the way that would cause the least pain and disruption. He suggested that our father had made his decision while grieving and perhaps not thinking clearly about the consequences for everyone involved. The responsible thing, Marcus argued, would be to decline the inheritance gracefully and allow the family to heal from the shocking revelation without the added stress of a prolonged legal battle. After Marcus left, I sat in my kitchen chair for hours, replying his words and questioning my own motivations for the first time since the will reading. Was I being greedy by claiming an inheritance from a man I'd never known was my father? Did I have any right to disrupt the lives of people who'd grown up as Robert Whitman's acknowledged children? The doubt he'd planted began to grow, exactly as he'd intended. Grace arrived that afternoon with groceries and her usual practical wisdom, immediately sensing my emotional turmoil and the pressure I was feeling from the Whitman family's campaign. She listened carefully as I recounted both Victoria's phone call and Marcus's visit, her expression growing more serious as she recognized the sophisticated manipulation tactics being employed against me. Her response was characteristically direct and grounded in the values she'd tried to instill in me throughout my formative years. She reminded me that Robert Whitman had made his decision while fully aware of the consequences and complications it would create. He'd had years to consider his choices and had ultimately decided that acknowledging me as his daughter and heir was the right thing to do, regardless of the family's reaction. Grace also pointed out something I'd been too overwhelmed to consider fully. The inheritance wasn't just about money or business assets, it was about recognition and validation of my existence as Robert Whitman's daughter. By renouncing the inheritance, I would be accepting the family's characterization of me as an unwanted mistake, rather than claiming my rightful place as his child. The financial aspects were secondary to the fundamental question of identity and belonging. That evening brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Julia Whitman, who appeared at my door with a different approach than her mother and brother had taken. She was elegantly dressed, but had clearly been crying, her makeup slightly smudged and her usual composure notably absent. Her strategy was emotional rather than logical, focusing on the personal impact the inheritance dispute was having on the family. Julia spoke about her father's memory and the confusion she felt about his secret relationship with my mother. She described feeling betrayed by the revelation that he'd maintained a hidden life and questioned whether she'd ever really known the man she'd called father. Her pain seemed genuine, and her vulnerability was a stark contrast to the hostility I'd encountered from Victoria and Marcus. She shared childhood memories of Robert Whitman, painting a picture of a devoted father who'd attended school events, coached soccer games, and had been actively involved in her and Marcus's lives. The idea that he'd been simultaneously maintaining a relationship with another woman and supporting a secret daughter challenged everything she believed about her family and her father's character. Her confusion and hurt were palpable, making me feel guilty for being the catalyst for her emotional turmoil. Julia's plea was more personal than her family members' previous attempts at persuasion. She asked me to consider the emotional cost of pursuing the inheritance, not just for the family, but for myself as well. She suggested that I would never be truly accepted by Riverside society or their social circle, that I would always be viewed as the outsider who disrupted an established family for financial gain. Her words were designed to make me feel isolated and unwelcome in the world I would theoretically inherit. The psychological warfare being waged by the Whitman family was sophisticated and relentless, each member approaching me with a different strategy designed to exploit potential vulnerabilities and insecurities. Victoria's threats, Marcus's logical arguments, and Julia's emotional appeals created a comprehensive campaign to pressure me into abandoning my legal rights voluntarily, rather than forcing them to challenge the will through formal court proceedings. The constant pressure began taking its toll on my daily life and emotional well-being. I found it difficult to concentrate at work, frequently distracted by phone calls from family members or their representatives. My coworkers at the hotel had learned about the inheritance through local gossip networks, and their treatment of me began to change in subtle but noticeable ways. Some showed increased deference and respect, while others seemed resentful or suspicious of my new circumstances.
Mr. Peterson called me into his office midweek to discuss my employment status in light of recent developments. His manner was awkward and uncertain, clearly unsure how to handle the unprecedented situation of having an employee who was potentially worth tens of millions of dollars. He suggested that I might want to consider taking a leave of absence while the legal matters were resolved, ostensibly to protect my privacy, but obviously concerned about the disruption my presence was causing. The media attention began slowly, but steadily intensified as word of the inheritance dispute spread through Riverside's social networks and beyond. Local newspaper reporters started calling the hotel and showing up at my apartment, seeking comments about the shocking revelation and the family's reaction. The Whitman family's prominence in the community made the story particularly newsworthy, especially the dramatic circumstances of a secret daughter inheriting the bulk of a business empire. Sleep became increasingly elusive as the stress of the situation mounted. I lay awake each night replaying conversations with family members, questioning my decisions, and wondering if I was being selfish or naive in pursuing my inheritance rights. The doubt and uncertainty were exactly what the Whitman family intended to create, part of their strategy to wear down my resolve and convince me to walk away voluntarily. Part 3. Reinforcement Network. The whisper campaign began subtly, but spread through Riverside with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Everywhere I went, conversations stopped when I approached, only to resume in hushed tones once I passed. The carefully crafted narrative being circulated painted me as an opportunistic gold digger who had somehow manipulated a grieving widower into acknowledging a fraudulent paternity claim for financial gain. Mrs. Henderson from the bank looked at me with barely concealed disdain when I attempted to conduct routine business, her previously friendly demeanor replaced by cold professionalism. The pharmacist who had always greeted me warmly now served me in silence, his eyes avoiding direct contact as if my presence was somehow contaminating his establishment. Even the grocery store clerks treated me differently, their casual friendliness replaced by suspicious scrutiny. The social isolation was more effective than any direct confrontation could have been. Victoria Whitman understood the power of community opinion in a place like Riverside, where reputation and social standing determined access to everything from business opportunities to simple social acceptance. By controlling the narrative and positioning me as an outsider, seeking to profit from tragedy, she was systematically destroying any potential support network I might have developed. The country club where the Whitman family held membership became a center of gossip and speculation about my motives and background. Members who'd never heard of me before the will reading suddenly had strong opinions about my character and the legitimacy of my claims. The story grew more elaborate with each retelling, transforming from a simple paternity revelation into a complex conspiracy involving manipulation, fraud, and deliberate deception. Dr. Patricia Wells, the family physician who'd treated the Whitmans for decades, made subtle but pointed comments about the importance of DNA testing accuracy and the possibility of laboratory errors or sample contamination. Her medical authority lent credibility to doubts about my paternity, even though she had no direct knowledge of the testing procedures or results. Her comments were carefully phrased to avoid legal liability while still undermining confidence in the evidence supporting my claim. The local newspaper editor, James Mitchell, was a longtime friend of the Whitman family and regular attendee at their social gatherings and charitable events. His editorial coverage of the inheritance dispute was subtly biased in favor of the family's position, emphasizing their shock and distress while questioning the timing and circumstances of my paternity claim. He avoided making direct accusations, but asked pointed questions about my background and motivations that reinforced public skepticism. Sarah Coleman, who owned the boutique where Julia Whitman frequently shopped, began spreading stories about my inappropriate behavior and presumptuous attitude during my brief visit to purchase appropriate clothing for the will reading. According to her embellished account, I'd acted entitled and demanding, making comments about soon being able to afford anything in the store. The story was complete fiction, but it spread rapidly through the social networks that defined Riverside's elite circles. Even my former teachers from the community college began receiving visits from people claiming to be conducting background checks for potential employers. The visitors asked detailed questions about my academic performance, personal character, and any signs of unusual ambition or manipulative behavior.
While they presented themselves as legitimate investigators, their questions clearly sought information that could be used to damage my reputation and credibility. The psychological impact of this coordinated campaign was devastating and precisely calculated to achieve maximum effect. Every interaction with community members became an exercise in anxiety and self-doubt, as I wondered what stories they'd heard and what assumptions they'd made about my character and motivations. The isolation made me question my own perceptions and judgment, exactly as the Whitman family intended. Grace remained my only reliable ally during this period, but even she began facing pressure and social consequences for supporting me. Her longtime friends at church started treating her with coolness and distance, some suggesting that she was being naive or misled about my true nature. The bridge club she had belonged to for 15 years suddenly became less welcoming, with members making pointed comments about the importance of knowing someone's true character before offering support. The harassment extended to my workplace, where several prominent guests specifically requested different housekeeping staff when they learned I would be cleaning their rooms. The hotel's management found themselves in an impossible position, trying to maintain good relations with wealthy clients while avoiding obvious discrimination against an employee who had done
Nothing wrong. The tension was palpable and made my job increasingly difficult and uncomfortable. Anonymous letters began arriving at my apartment, some containing outright threats, while others offered unsolicited advice about leaving town for my own safety and well-being. The messages were carefully worded to avoid crossing legal lines while still creating an atmosphere of intimidation and fear. They referenced my foster care background and suggested that I should be grateful for what I'd already received rather than demanding more than I deserved. The campaign's sophistication became evident in how different community members seemed to know exactly what arguments to make and what doubts to raise. Marcus Whitman had clearly briefed his allies on the most effective talking points, ensuring that I encountered consistent messaging wherever I went. The coordination was subtle but unmistakable, designed to make me feel completely isolated and overwhelmed by the unanimous opposition to my inheritance claim. Local business owners who'd never interacted with me before suddenly had opinions about my character and motivations. The owner of the coffee shop where I occasionally studied began making pointed comments about people who tried to take advantage of others' generosity and kindness. The mechanic who serviced my aging car started questioning whether I'd be able to afford his services much longer, suggesting that my current circumstances might be temporary. Even well-meaning community members who might have been sympathetic to my situation were influenced by the constant stream of negative information and speculation. They began to view me through the lens of suspicion and doubt that the Whitman family had so carefully constructed, making it nearly impossible for me to find genuine support or understanding among people who'd known me only superficially before the inheritance dispute began. The religious community, where Grace had hoped to find support and understanding, proved particularly susceptible to the narrative of moral corruption and greed that Victoria Whitman promoted. Pastor Williams, who'd known Grace for decades, began asking pointed questions about whether she was certain of my character and motivations. His doubt was particularly painful because Grace had trusted him to provide spiritual guidance during this difficult period. The effectiveness of the social pressure campaign was evident in how it influenced my own behavior and self-perception. I began second-guessing every decision and interaction, wondering if I was somehow proving their characterizations correct through my responses to their treatment. The constant scrutiny and judgment created a cycle of anxiety and self-doubt that made it increasingly difficult to maintain confidence in my legal rights and moral position. Part 4. Escalating problems. The first direct sabotage attempt came disguised as helpful concern for my welfare and safety. Someone had called the hotel's management to report that I'd been making threatening statements about the Whitman family and discussing plans for revenge against people who opposed my inheritance claim. The accusation was completely false, but it forced Mr. Peterson to conduct a formal investigation and document the incident in my employment file. My car began experiencing mysterious mechanical problems that seemed to occur at the most inconvenient times possible. The brake system needed unexpected repairs just days after passing inspection, and the transmission started failing without warning during my commute to work. My mechanic, Tony Rodriguez, seemed genuinely puzzled by the sudden cascade of expensive problems in a vehicle that had been running reliably for months. The harassment escalated beyond social pressure into more direct interference with my daily life and routine activities. My apartment's mailbox was repeatedly vandalized, and important correspondence began disappearing before I could retrieve it. Bills went unpaid because notices never reached me, creating problems with utility companies and service providers who had no knowledge of the deliberate interference. Anonymous complaints to my landlord, Mrs. Chen, claimed that I was disturbing other tenants with loud parties and inappropriate visitors at all hours. The accusations were baseless, but they required formal responses and documentation that consumed time and energy I couldn't spare while dealing with the inheritance dispute. Mrs. Chen, though generally supportive, was obligated to investigate all complaints and maintain detailed records of the situation. My community college professors began receiving visits from people claiming to be potential employers conducting background checks. The visitors asked leading questions about my emotional stability, academic honesty, and any signs of manipulative or deceptive behavior. While my professors maintained appropriate confidentiality, the constant scrutiny created an atmosphere of suspicion and doubt about my character and motivations. The bank, where I maintained my modest savings account, suddenly required additional documentation for routine transactions, citing new policies about enhanced verification procedures. The manager, Mr. Thompson, seemed apologetic but insisted that the requirements were mandated by federal regulations, though similar demands weren't being made of other customers. The additional bureaucracy made simple banking transactions time-consuming and frustrating. My health insurance coverage became problematic when someone called the provider claiming to represent me and requesting policy cancellation due to upcoming changes in my financial circumstances. The insurance company, following standard procedures, processed the request and left me without coverage until I could prove my identity and restore the policy. The gap in coverage lasted 3 weeks and left me vulnerable during an already stressful period. The local credit reporting agencies received notifications claiming that I'd moved out of state and requested that my credit files be transferred to different regional offices. The bureaucratic confusion created problems with existing accounts and made it nearly impossible to establish new services or relationships that required credit checks. Resolving the errors required extensive documentation and weeks of phone calls to various agencies. Grace's support became increasingly costly for her personally as the social pressure campaign intensified. Her longtime hairdresser, Margaret Santos, began scheduling her appointments at inconvenient times and making subtle comments about the importance of choosing friends wisely. The garden club that she'd belonged to for 20 years suddenly found reasons to exclude her from planning committees and social events she'd previously helped organize. The interference extended to her family relationships and business dealings. My legal representation when someone called David Chen's law firm claiming to be my authorized representative and requesting that all communications be redirected to a different attorney. The attempt to disrupt my legal counsel was discovered quickly, but it demonstrated the lengths to which my opponents were willing to go to sabotage my position in the inheritance dispute. My employment situation became increasingly untenable as prominent hotel guests continued requesting different housekeeping assignments. Mr. Peterson found himself constantly juggling schedules and assignments to accommodate client preferences while maintaining some semblance of fair treatment for his employees. The situation was creating operational difficulties and putting pressure on other staff members who had to cover additional responsibilities. The stress of constant harassment and sabotage began taking a visible toll on my physical and emotional health. I lost weight due to difficulty sleeping and eating regularly, and my hands developed a slight tremor from anxiety and exhaustion.
The physical symptoms only reinforced the narrative that I was unstable and perhaps not capable of handling the responsibilities that would come with substantial wealth. Medical appointments became problematic when my primary care physician's office received calls claiming that I'd moved and needed my medical records transferred to providers in other states. The confusion disrupted routine care and prescription refills, creating additional health complications during an already stressful period. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, my physician, was sympathetic but required extensive verification before restoring normal service. The harassment campaign's psychological impact was cumulative and carefully designed to create maximum stress and anxiety. Each individual incident might have been manageable in isolation, but the constant stream of problems and complications created an overwhelming sense of being under siege. The attackers understood that sustained pressure over time would be more effective than any single dramatic confrontation. Financial pressures mounted as the various problems required costly solutions and professional interventions. Legal consultations, mechanical repairs, documentation fees, and other expenses quickly depleted my modest savings account. The financial strain was undoubtedly intentional, designed to make me more receptive to settlement offers and less able to pursue my inheritance claim through extended court proceedings. The campaign's effectiveness was evident in how it influenced my daily decision-making and behavior patterns. I began avoiding public places where I might encounter hostile community members, limiting my social interactions to essential activities only. The isolation played directly into my opponent's strategy of making me feel completely alone and unsupported in my legal battle. Sleep became increasingly elusive as anxiety about potential problems and complications consumed my thoughts. I found myself constantly checking locks, reviewing mail, and verifying that systems were functioning properly. The hypervigilance was exhausting and counterproductive, but seemed necessary given the escalating pattern of interference and sabotage. Part 5, Catalyst Moment. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when I returned from my shift at the hotel to find my apartment door standing open and my belongings scattered across the floor. Someone had conducted a thorough search of my personal space, leaving no drawer unopened or surface unexamined. The violation felt deeply personal and threatening in a way that all the previous harassment had not achieved. My laptop computer was missing, along with several important documents related to the inheritance case that I'd been reviewing with Grace's help. The thieves had been selective, taking items with potential legal significance while leaving behind electronics and personal belongings that would have been valuable to typical burglars. The targeted nature of the theft made it clear that this was not a random crime, but a calculated attack on my legal position. The police response was professional but limited, with Officer Jennifer Walsh taking detailed statements and photographing the scene for evidence. However, the lack of signs of forced entry and the selective nature of the theft made it difficult to pursue meaningful leads or identify suspects. The officer's report would be filed and investigated, but the realistic prospects for recovering the stolen items or identifying the perpetrators were minimal. Mrs. Chen, my landlord, was visibly shaken by the break-in and expressed concerns about the security of her property and the safety of other tenants. While she stopped short of asking me to move, her discomfort was obvious and added another layer of pressure to an already impossible situation. The building's other residents began treating me with suspicion, wondering if my presence was attracting dangerous attention to their homes. Grace arrived within an hour of my phone call, her maternal instincts overriding any concerns about her own safety or reputation. She helped me secure the apartment and document the damage while providing emotional support during one of the most frightening experiences of my life. Her unwavering loyalty in the face of escalating threats demonstrated the depth of her character and commitment to my welfare. David Chen's response to news of the break-in was immediate and decisive. He arranged for professional security consultation and advised me to consider relocating to a safer environment while the legal proceedings continued. His concern was both professional and personal, recognizing that the theft of legal documents could compromise my case and that my physical safety might be at genuine risk. The stolen documents included copies of financial records, DNA test results, and correspondence with the attorney's office that would have been valuable to opponents seeking to understand my legal strategy. While originals remained secure in Chen's office, the theft represented a significant breach of confidentiality and could influence how the case proceeded through the court system. The break-in was the catalyst that finally forced me to confront the reality of what I was facing and make a definitive decision about how to proceed. The escalating harassment and sabotage had demonstrated that the Whitman family and their allies were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to prevent me from claiming my inheritance. The situation had moved beyond simple family dispute into territory that posed genuine risks to my safety and well-being. That night, unable to sleep in my violated apartment, I sat at Grace's kitchen table reviewing everything that had happened since the will reading. The pattern of escalating pressure and interference was clearly designed to force me into abandoning my legal rights rather than enduring continued harassment.
The break-in represented a significant escalation that suggested even more serious threats might follow if I persisted with my claim. The psychological impact of the break-in was profound and lasting, creating a sense of vulnerability and violation that affected every aspect of my daily life. Knowing that someone had systematically searched through my personal belongings and stolen items with legal significance made me question whether any aspect of my life remained private or secure. The feeling of being constantly watched and threatened was overwhelming. Grace's guest bedroom became my temporary refuge, but even there I found it difficult to relax or feel truly safe. The knowledge that my opponents had been willing to commit serious crimes to advance their cause made it impossible to predict what other tactics they might employ. The escalation suggested that the stakes were higher than I'd initially understood, and that the family's determination to prevent my inheritance was absolute. The morning after the break-in brought a phone call from Victoria Whitman that was markedly different in tone from her previous communications. Her voice carried a note of sympathy and concern as she expressed shock and dismay about the burglary. She suggested that my continued pursuit of the inheritance claim was attracting dangerous attention from people who might seek to exploit my circumstances for their own benefit. Her offer this time included not just financial settlement, but also personal protection and security arrangements that would ensure my safety if I agreed to abandon the inheritance claim. She painted herself as someone who genuinely feared for my welfare and wanted to help me escape from a situation that had become dangerous and unpredictable. The timing and content of her call made it clear that she was aware of the break-in's details and its intended message. Marcus Whitman arrived at Grace's house later that morning, his demeanor serious and concerned as he outlined the escalating risks associated with my continued pursuit of the inheritance. He spoke about the family's inability to control all the various interests and parties who might have stakes in the outcome of the legal proceedings. His message was clear. The situation had moved beyond their direct control and into territory where they couldn't guarantee my safety. The implication was that withdrawing from the inheritance dispute was not just financially prudent, but necessary for my physical safety and well-being. Marcus presented himself as someone who was genuinely worried about my welfare and wanted to help me find a solution that would protect me from further harm. His tone was more urgent and serious than in previous conversations, suggesting that the threats were real and immediate. Julia Whitman's visit that afternoon completed the family's coordinated response to the break-in. Her emotional appeal focused on the family's shock and horror that the situation had escalated to criminal activity. They claimed that they had never intended for things to become dangerous and were now deeply concerned about my safety and the safety of everyone involved in the dispute. Her tears seemed genuine as she begged me to consider accepting the family settlement offer for my own protection.
She painted a picture of a situation that had spiraled out of control and attracted attention from dangerous people who were willing to commit serious crimes to influence the outcome. The message was clear. Continuing to pursue my inheritance claim would put everyone at risk, including innocent family members who are being drawn into a dangerous situation.
Attempting to position themselves to exploit my circumstances if I succeeded in claiming the inheritance. Their warnings about these threats seemed credible and were supported by detailed intelligence reports that demonstrated extensive surveillance capabilities. Grace's reaction to the morning visitors was immediate and protective, her maternal instincts activated by what she recognized as sophisticated intimidation tactics disguised as helpful concern. She insisted on being present during the entire conversation and took detailed notes about the men's claims, proposals, and implied threats. Her questions about their legal authority and business credentials clearly made them uncomfortable and exposed gaps in their carefully prepared presentation. After Pierce and Davidson left, Grace and I spent hours researching their claimed business affiliations and credentials online. While their company appeared legitimate and their business cards seemed authentic, we discovered inconsistencies in their background information and questions about their actual authority to make the offers they'd presented. The investigation raised suspicions that they might be representatives of the Whitman family rather than independent business interests. Chen's response to our report about the morning visit was immediate and deeply concerned. He recognized the tactics being employed as sophisticated corporate intimidation designed to pressure me into accepting unfavorable terms without proper legal consultation. His experience with similar cases had taught him that such visits often preceded escalated pressure campaigns that could include more serious threats and interference. The attorney arranged for an emergency security consultation and advised me to avoid any further direct contact with representatives claiming to speak for business interests or investment groups. His investigation into Pierce and Davidson's credentials revealed that while their company existed, their specific roles and authority to make settlement offers were questionable at best. The discovery suggested that the Whitman family had hired professional negotiators to supplement their own pressure campaign. By afternoon, the harassment had evolved into more direct interference with my support network and daily activities. Grace received a phone call from someone claiming to represent the Internal Revenue Service, asking detailed questions about her financial relationship with me and suggesting that she might be liable for taxes on any assistance she'd provided. The call was clearly designed to frighten her and potentially drive a wedge between us. My community college professors began receiving official-looking letters questioning my academic integrity and requesting investigations into potential plagiarism or other misconduct. The accusations were baseless, but required formal responses that consumed their time and energy while creating doubt about my character and honesty. The coordinated nature of these attacks demonstrated extensive planning and resources. Chen's law firm started experiencing technical difficulties with their computer systems and phone networks that seemed to coincide with attempts to access files related to my case. While the problems might have been coincidental, their timing and nature suggested possible cyber attacks designed to disrupt our legal preparations. The attorney hired additional security consultants and implemented enhanced protection protocols for all case-related communications. The pressure extended to Grace's employer, where she worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm. Someone had called her supervisor to report concerns about her emotional stability and reliability following her involvement in a controversial legal dispute. While her supervisor was supportive and dismissed the complaints, the incident demonstrated that my opponents were willing to target anyone who provided me with assistance or support. Local service providers began experiencing unusual problems with my accounts and service agreements. The electric company received requests to disconnect service due to alleged non-payment, despite my bills being current. The phone company was notified that I'd moved out of state and requested service termination. Each incident required time-consuming verification processes and created disruptions that added stress and uncertainty to daily life. The escalating interference campaign was clearly designed to isolate me from all sources of support while creating maximum stress and uncertainty about my circumstances.
The coordination and sophistication of the attacks suggested professional involvement and substantial financial resources, indicating that the Whitman family was treating my inheritance claim as a serious threat, requiring extreme measures to neutralize. Grace's church community became another target of the influence campaign, with several prominent members receiving visits from people claiming to be concerned about her involvement with someone of questionable character. Pastor Williams was approached by a man claiming to be a private investigator who shared fabricated evidence about my supposed criminal background and warned about the spiritual dangers of supporting someone involved in fraudulent activities. The medical harassment escalated when my health insurance provider received notifications that I died in an automobile accident and requested immediate policy cancellation. The false death report triggered automatic processes that required extensive documentation to reverse and left me temporarily without coverage during a period when stress-related health problems were requiring medical attention. The incident demonstrated both the creativity and cruelty of my opponent's tactics. Banking relationships became increasingly problematic as financial institutions received conflicting information about my identity, residence, and account status. Credit reporting agencies were notified of address changes, employment terminations, and debt defaults that were completely fictional, but required extensive effort to investigate and correct. The financial warfare was designed to make normal business relationships impossible while undermining my credibility with service providers. My car registration was flagged for alleged traffic violations in other states, triggering automatic license suspensions that had to be challenged through bureaucratic processes. The DMV received reports that my vehicle had been involved in hit-and-run accidents and drug trafficking activities, claims that were easily disproven but required formal investigations and hearings. Each incident consumed time and energy while creating additional stress and uncertainty about my circumstances. The psychological warfare reached new levels of sophistication with the introduction of what appeared to be surveillance teams that followed me during routine activities. While I couldn't prove they were watching me,
Presence of the same vehicles and individuals in multiple locations created a sense of being constantly monitored and threatened. The surveillance, whether real or manufactured, was clearly designed to increase anxiety and paranoia. Sleep deprivation became a serious health concern, as the constant stress and uncertainty made rest nearly impossible. Even in Grace's secure guest room, I found myself listening for unusual sounds and checking locks repeatedly throughout the night. The hypervigilance was exhausting and counterproductive, but seemed necessary given the escalating pattern of interference and threats. Chen's security team discovered evidence of electronic surveillance equipment in Grace's neighborhood, including devices that could monitor phone calls and internet communications. While they couldn't prove the equipment was targeting us specifically, its presence suggested that our communications might be compromised and that our opponents had access to information about our legal strategy and personal circumstances. Part 7. Isolation Tactics. The systematic destruction of my relationships reached a new level of sophistication when several of my former foster siblings began receiving visits from people claiming to be journalists, researching a story about abuse in the foster care system. The visitors asked leading questions about my behavior during our shared placements, seeking any information that could be used to paint me as troubled, manipulative, or dishonest during my formative years. Amanda Walsh, who had been like a sister to me during our 2 years in the same foster home, called me in tears after one of these interviews. The visitor had twisted her innocent comments about typical teenage conflicts into suggestions that I had exhibited concerning behavioral patterns and had difficulties with authority figures. She was devastated to learn that her words might be used against me and apologized repeatedly for not recognizing the true purpose of the interview. The campaign expanded to include my former coworkers from previous jobs, reaching back years into my employment history to find anyone who might have negative comments about my work performance or personal character. A retail supervisor from a part-time job I'd held during high school was contacted by someone claiming to conduct a routine employment verification, but the questions focused on my honesty, reliability, and relationships with customers and coworkers. Grace's adult children, who lived in other states and had only met me a few times, began receiving phone calls from people claiming to be concerned family friends.
The caller suggested that their mother was being taken advantage of by someone with questionable motives and warned that her financial security and emotional well-being might be at risk. While her children were supportive and dismissed these concerns, the calls created family tension and worry about Grace's judgment. My academic records became the target of a sophisticated disinformation campaign designed to raise questions about my intellectual capabilities and academic honesty. Someone had contacted my high school guidance counselor, claiming to be a college admissions officer verifying transcripts, but actually seeking information about any disciplinary problems or questions about grade authenticity. The counselor was suspicious of the inquiry and refused to provide information, but the attempt demonstrated the thoroughness of the investigation into my background. The isolation tactics extended to my professional relationships and future opportunities. Several local businesses where I had submitted job applications in the past received anonymous tips suggesting that I was involved in fraudulent activities and might pose risks to their operations and reputation. While these businesses had no immediate openings that affected me, the negative information would remain in their files and could influence future employment decisions. Chen's investigation revealed that a private detective agency with connections to corporate security firms had been conducting extensive background research on me and everyone in my support network. The investigation included surveillance, interviews with acquaintances, and attempts to access confidential records through various pretenses. The scope and expense of this research indicated that substantial resources were being devoted to building a case against my character and credibility. The harassment campaign targeted Grace's financial relationships and business connections in an attempt to create pressure on her to distance herself from my situation. Her longtime bank received anonymous tips suggesting that she might be involved in money laundering or other financial crimes related to her support for my inheritance claim. While the bank's investigation quickly dismissed these allegations, the scrutiny was embarrassing and stressful for someone who had maintained impeccable financial records throughout her life. Local merchants and service providers began receiving visits from people claiming to represent credit agencies or business bureaus, warning them about potential fraud risks associated with accepting payments or providing services to me. Several businesses began requiring cash payments or additional verification for routine transactions, making simple purchases more complicated and drawing unwanted attention to my circumstances. The social isolation became complete when even casual acquaintances and neighbors began treating me with suspicion and hostility. Someone had been systematically spreading rumors throughout the community about my supposed involvement in criminal activities and fraudulent schemes. The stories were elaborate and consistent, suggesting careful planning and coordination among multiple sources. Grace's medical care was disrupted when her longtime physician received anonymous reports suggesting that she might be suffering from dementia or other cognitive impairments that could affect her judgment and decision-making abilities. The doctor was obligated to conduct additional evaluations and consultations, creating delays in routine care and raising questions about her mental competency that could potentially affect her legal ability to support my case. The campaign's psychological impact was devastating and precisely calculated to create maximum stress and despair. Every aspect of my life and relationships had been systematically attacked, leaving me feeling completely alone and defenseless against enemies who seemed to have unlimited resources and no moral constraints. The isolation was so complete that I began questioning my own perceptions and wondering if I was somehow responsible for the chaos surrounding me. My employment at the hotel became untenable when several major corporate clients threatened to cancel their contracts if I remained on staff. The clients claimed they were
Concerned about security risks and potential negative publicity associated with employing someone involved in a controversial legal dispute. Mr. Peterson was clearly distressed as he explained that the hotel's financial survival depended on maintaining these relationships. Chen's law firm experienced its own pressure campaign when several of his other clients received anonymous letters suggesting that their attorney was involved in fraudulent activities and might not be providing competent representation. While these clients remained loyal and supportive, the attacks on his reputation created distractions and consumed resources that should have been devoted to my case. The isolation tactics included sophisticated psychological warfare designed to make me doubt my own sanity and judgment. I began receiving phone calls at random hours from people who claimed to know information about my father or family history, but when I tried to get details, they would hang up or provide contradictory information. The calls seemed designed to create hope and confusion rather than provide genuine assistance. Grace's church membership became a source of conflict when several influential congregation members began questioning whether she should be supporting someone involved in such a controversial situation. Pastor Williams found himself caught between his pastoral obligations to support a longtime member and pressure from donors who threatened to reduce their contributions if the church appeared to endorse my cause. The harassment extended to my mail and package deliveries, with items regularly disappearing or being delivered to wrong addresses. Important legal documents and personal correspondence never reached their destinations, creating additional complications and communication problems. The Postal Service seemed unable to resolve these delivery problems despite multiple complaints and investigations. Professional counseling became necessary to deal with the psychological stress of constant harassment and isolation, but even my therapist's office experienced unusual problems with appointment scheduling and patient records. Someone had called claiming to be me and attempting to cancel sessions or change appointment times, creating confusion and delays in receiving necessary mental health support. Part 8. Breakthrough Intervention. The turning point came through an unexpected source when Detective Lisa Rodriguez from the State Police White Collar Crime Unit contacted Chen's office with information about a broader investigation into corporate fraud and corruption that had uncovered evidence related to my harassment campaign. Her unit had been monitoring suspicious financial transactions and communication patterns that connected several seemingly unrelated cases involving wealthy families and corporate interests. Rodriguez explained that my situation had come to their attention through electronic surveillance of known corporate security firms that specialized in what they euphemistically called reputation management and legal support services. The detectives' investigation had revealed a sophisticated network of private investigators, corporate lawyers, and security consultants who provided harassment and intimidation services to wealthy clients seeking to avoid unfavorable legal outcomes. The evidence Rodriguez presented was extensive and shocking in its scope and organization. Financial records showed substantial payments from accounts controlled by the Whitman family to security firms with documented histories of illegal surveillance, harassment, and intimidation tactics. Phone records revealed coordination between multiple parties in planning and executing the systematic campaign against me and my support network. Chen's excitement about this development was immediate and profound, recognizing that the evidence could transform my case from a simple inheritance dispute into a criminal matter involving conspiracy, harassment, and witness intimidation. The discovery meant that we would no longer be fighting alone against superior resources, but would have the support of law enforcement agencies with their own interest in exposing and prosecuting these activities. Rodriguez arranged for me to meet with federal investigators who were working on related cases involving corporate corruption and organized harassment campaigns. The FBI had been building cases against several firms that provided illegal services to wealthy clients, and my situation provided additional evidence and testimony that could strengthen their prosecutions while providing protection and support for my own legal battle. The federal investigation revealed that the harassment campaign against me was just one example of a broader pattern of illegal activities that these firms regularly conducted for wealthy clients. Similar tactics had been used against whistleblowers, business competitors, and other individuals who posed threats to their clients' financial interests. The discovery meant that I was part of a larger criminal conspiracy rather than an isolated victim of family conflict. Agent Sarah Thompson from the FBI's White Collar Crime Division explained that their investigation had identified multiple victims of similar harassment campaigns, and that my cooperation would be crucial in building cases that could shut down these operations permanently. She offered federal protection and resources that would enable me to pursue my inheritance claim without fear of continued harassment or intimidation. The evidence collected by federal investigators included recorded phone conversations, financial transaction records, and internal communications from the security firms that demonstrated clear knowledge that their activities were illegal. The documentation showed that these firms routinely provided services that included surveillance, harassment, document theft, and witness intimidation for clients who were willing to pay premium prices for guaranteed results. Chen's review of the federal evidence revealed that the harassment campaign against me had been more extensive and sophisticated than we had realized. The firms involved had conducted comprehensive background investigations, not just on me, but on everyone in my support network, identifying vulnerabilities and pressure points that could be exploited to achieve maximum psychological impact. The breakthrough also provided explanations for many of the mysterious problems and coincidences that had plagued my daily life over the previous weeks. The electronic surveillance, financial interference, and systematic disruption of relationships had all been coordinated through professional services that specialized in these exact tactics. Knowing that these problems had been deliberately created was somehow less disturbing than believing they were random misfortunes.
Investigation had also uncovered evidence of similar campaigns against other inheritance claimants and legal adversaries of wealthy families throughout the region. The pattern suggested that these tactics were routinely employed by certain law firms and security consultants as standard practice for clients who wanted to avoid unfavorable legal outcomes through intimidation rather than legitimate legal argument. The federal protection offered to me included relocation to a secure facility, regular security monitoring, and legal support that would enable me to pursue my inheritance claim without fear of continued harassment. Agent Thompson explained that my testimony would be crucial in prosecuting the firms involved and that my cooperation would be rewarded with full protection and support throughout the legal process. Chen's strategic thinking about the case changed dramatically with the introduction of federal law enforcement support. Instead of fighting a defensive battle against superior resources, we could now take the offensive against opponents who had exposed themselves to serious criminal liability through their illegal tactics. The harassment campaign that had been designed to weaken my position had actually provided evidence that could destroy my opponents. The psychological relief of learning that the harassment had been professionally orchestrated, rather than reflecting genuine community opposition, was enormous and immediate. Many of the people who had treated me with suspicion and hostility had been manipulated by false information and coordinated pressure campaigns. The discovery that I wasn't actually facing universal community opposition restored some of my confidence and sense of reality. Grace's reaction to the federal investigation was a mixture of relief and anger, as she realized the extent to which we had been manipulated and deceived. Her own community relationships and professional standing had been systematically attacked through deliberate lies and manufactured evidence. The knowledge that these problems had been artificially created helped restore her confidence in her own judgment and perceptions. The federal investigators were particularly interested in the break-in at my apartment and the theft of legal documents, recognizing these activities as serious federal crimes that carried substantial penalties. The evidence suggested that the theft had been conducted by professionals with experience in corporate espionage and legal intimidation, and that the stolen documents had been shared with the Whitman family's legal team in violation of attorney-client privilege and other legal protections. Agent Thompson explained that the federal investigation would provide immunity from prosecution for my cooperation, while ensuring that the firms responsible for the harassment campaign would face serious criminal charges. The prospect of seeing my tormentors held accountable for their illegal activities was satisfying and provided motivation to continue fighting despite the personal costs and risks involved. Part 9. Initial evidence discovery. The federal investigation's evidence vault contained a treasure trove of documentation that painted a detailed picture of the harassment campaign's organization and execution. Financial records showed a sophisticated money trail connecting the Whitman family to multiple shell companies and security firms that had been contracted to provide what internal documents refer to as comprehensive reputation management and legal support services. Agent Thompson presented recordings of phone conversations between Victoria Whitman and representatives of Blackwater Security Solutions, a firm that specialized in corporate espionage and legal intimidation. The conversations revealed explicit instructions to neutralize the inheritance threat through any means necessary, with specific authorization for surveillance, harassment, and document acquisition activities that were clearly illegal under federal law. The recorded conversations also included Marcus Whitman discussing the need to manage the narrative and ensure that I would be viewed as an unstable opportunist rather than a legitimate heir. His instructions to the security firm included creating false evidence of mental instability, financial desperation, and criminal associations that could be used to undermine my credibility in court proceedings and community relationships. Julia Whitman's involvement was documented through email communications with public relations consultants who had been hired to plant negative stories about me in local media outlets and social networks. Her correspondence revealed detailed strategies for portraying me as a gold digger who had manipulated a grieving family for financial gain, with specific talking points and fabricated evidence to support these characterizations. The evidence included detailed surveillance reports that had been compiled over months of monitoring my activities, relationships, and daily routines. The reports contained intimate details about my personal life, work schedule, and financial circumstances that had been gathered through illegal surveillance and used to plan targeted harassment activities designed to cause maximum psychological damage. Chen's examination of the evidence revealed sophisticated psychological profiling that had been conducted to identify my vulnerabilities and pressure points. The analysis included recommendations for specific harassment tactics that would be most effective based on my background, personality, and support relationships. The clinical nature of this psychological warfare was particularly disturbing and demonstrated the professional expertise involved in the campaign.
Parties. Agent Thompson's investigation had identified at least 12 other victims of similar harassment campaigns conducted by the same network of firms over the previous 3 years. The victims included business competitors, whistleblowers, and family members involved in inheritance disputes who had all experienced identical patterns of harassment, intimidation, and social isolation designed to force them into abandoning their legal claims. The federal evidence also revealed connections between these harassment campaigns and several unsolved crimes in the region, including break-ins, identity theft, and financial fraud that had previously been treated as unrelated incidents. The pattern suggested that these firms routinely engaged in serious criminal activities while maintaining legitimate business facades that provided cover for their illegal operations. Chen's legal analysis of the evidence indicated that the Whitman family's involvement in the harassment campaign would likely result in criminal charges and could completely undermine their position in the inheritance dispute. The illegal tactics they had employed to prevent my claim would instead provide grounds for additional legal action and potentially criminal prosecution that could result in substantial financial penalties and prison sentences. The recordings included conversations in which security firm representatives discussed specific plans for escalating harassment activities if initial tactics proved unsuccessful. The escalation plans included more serious criminal activities, such as physical intimidation, property destruction, and direct threats that demonstrated the potential dangers I had been facing throughout the campaign. Rodriguez's investigation revealed that these firms maintained extensive databases of personal information about potential targets and their associates, including detailed profiles that could be used for future harassment campaigns or sold to other clients with similar needs. The databases represented massive violations of privacy laws and provided evidence of ongoing criminal enterprises that extended far beyond my individual case. The federal evidence included documentation of corrupt relationships between these security firms and certain law enforcement officials who had been paid to provide information and protection that enabled their illegal activities. The corruption was extensive and had allowed these firms to operate with impunity while their victims had little recourse through normal legal channels. Agent Thompson explained that the evidence would be sufficient to prosecute multiple individuals and firms under federal racketeering statutes that carried severe penalties, including substantial prison sentences and asset forfeiture. The prosecutions would send a clear message to other firms that provided similar services and would help protect future victims from experiencing the same systematic harassment and intimidation. The psychological impact of seeing the detailed evidence of the conspiracy against me was both validating and disturbing. The documentation confirmed that my perceptions of being systematically targeted had been accurate, while revealing the extent of the criminal activities that had been directed against me and my support network. The evidence provided closure about many mysterious incidents, while raising concerns about the broader implications of such sophisticated harassment capabilities. Part 10. Investigation Expansion.
The federal investigation expanded rapidly as agents discovered connections between the harassment campaign against me and a broader network of corporate crime that extended across multiple states and involved dozens of law firms, security companies, and public relations consultancies. Agent Thompson explained that my case had become a crucial piece of evidence in a much larger prosecution that could dismantle an entire industry built on providing illegal services to wealthy clients. The investigation revealed that Blackwater Security Solutions was part of a franchise network of firms that operated under different names but provided identical services using standardized tactics and procedures. The network had been developed over several years by former intelligence operatives and corporate security specialists who had identified a lucrative market among wealthy individuals and corporations facing legal challenges they preferred to resolve through intimidation rather than legitimate legal processes. Financial analysis conducted by federal forensic accountants revealed a sophisticated money laundering operation that allowed clients to pay for illegal services through seemingly legitimate consulting contracts and legal fees. The scheme involved multiple layers of shell companies and offshore accounts that made it difficult to trace payments and provided plausible deniability for clients who could claim ignorance of specific tactics while benefiting from their results. The investigation uncovered evidence that this network had been responsible for hundreds of harassment campaigns over the previous 5 years, targeting whistleblowers, business competitors, inheritance claimants, and other individuals who posed threats to their clients' financial interests. The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering and included activities ranging from surveillance and harassment to document theft, witness intimidation, and financial sabotage. Rodriguez's analysis of communication patterns revealed that the firms involved maintained detailed databases of tactics and procedures that had been refined through years of experience with similar cases. The databases included psychological profiles of different types of targets and recommended harassment strategies based on demographic characteristics, personal vulnerabilities, and specific legal circumstances. The federal investigation also revealed corruption within local law enforcement agencies, with several officers having accepted payments in exchange for providing information about ongoing investigations and failing to pursue criminal complaints filed by harassment victims. The corruption had enabled the firms to operate with impunity while their victims had little recourse through normal legal channels. Chen's review of similar cases identified by federal investigators revealed disturbing patterns of success for these harassment campaigns. In over 60% of cases, targets had eventually abandoned their legal claims or accepted unfavorable settlements rather than enduring continued harassment and intimidation. The success rate demonstrated the effectiveness of these tactics and explained why wealthy clients were willing to pay premium prices for these services. The investigation expanded to include examination of judicial corruption, with evidence suggesting that certain judges had been influenced through campaign contributions and social pressure to make rulings favorable to clients of these firms, while proving direct
Corruption was difficult. The patterns of favorable rulings in cases involving these firms were statistically improbable and suggested systematic influence that extended beyond normal legal advocacy. Agent Thompson's team discovered that the network maintained extensive files on journalists, law enforcement officials, and political figures who might potentially investigate or expose their activities. The files included personal information that could be used for blackmail or intimidation, demonstrating the sophisticated nature of the criminal enterprise and its ability to protect itself from investigation and prosecution. The federal investigation revealed international connections with evidence that similar networks operated in other countries and shared information and tactics across national boundaries. The global scope of these operations indicated that harassment and intimidation services had become a substantial international business that served wealthy clients worldwide who preferred to resolve legal disputes through illegal means. Rodriguez's financial investigation uncovered evidence that some of the firms involved had been founded with capital provided by organized crime syndicates seeking to diversify into white-collar criminal activities. The connections explained the sophisticated nature of their operations and their willingness to engage in serious criminal activities that carried substantial risks and penalties.
The investigation also revealed that these firms routinely conducted counter-surveillance operations against law enforcement agencies to identify and avoid potential investigations. Their counterintelligence capabilities were sophisticated and included technical surveillance, infiltration of law enforcement communications, and cultivation of sources within government agencies that provided advance warning of potential problems. Agent Thompson explained that the federal prosecution would involve multiple agencies, including the FBI, IRS, and Department of Justice, with charges including racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, witness intimidation, and corruption of public officials. The prosecution would be one of the largest white-collar crime cases in the region's history and would likely result in substantial prison sentences for the principals involved. The investigation's expansion had identified additional victims who were willing to testify about their experiences with similar harassment campaigns. The testimony would provide prosecutors with multiple examples of the firm's criminal activities and would demonstrate the systematic nature of their operations. The victim testimony would be crucial in securing convictions and substantial sentences for the defendants. Chen's analysis of the expanded investigation indicated that the Whitman family's involvement in the harassment campaign would likely result in their facing criminal charges in addition to civil liability for damages resulting from their illegal activities. The criminal exposure could result in substantial fines, asset forfeiture, and potential prison sentences that would devastate their financial position and social standing. The psychological impact of learning about the broader scope of the criminal enterprise was both empowering and disturbing. The knowledge that I had been targeted by sophisticated professionals rather than facing genuine community opposition restored my confidence in my own perceptions while revealing the extensive criminal activities that wealthy individuals could access to avoid unfavorable legal outcomes. Agent Rodriguez's investigation had also uncovered evidence of political corruption involving campaign contributions and lobbying activities designed to prevent legislation that would strengthen penalties for harassment and intimidation crimes. The political influence operations demonstrated the network's sophisticated understanding of legal and regulatory systems and their ability to shape the environment in which they operated. Part 11. Complete exposure. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity on the morning that federal prosecutors presented their comprehensive case against the Whitman family and their network of criminal associates. Judge Margaret Harrison presided over proceedings that would expose the full scope of the harassment conspiracy and determine not only my inheritance rights, but also the criminal liability of everyone involved in the systematic campaign against me. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Foster opened with a presentation that laid out the entire criminal enterprise in devastating detail. His evidence included hundreds of recorded phone conversations, thousands of financial transaction records, and extensive documentation of illegal surveillance and harassment activities that painted a picture of sophisticated criminal conspiracy involving multiple law firms, security companies, and wealthy clients who believed their money could purchase immunity from legal consequences. The first witness called was Detective Lisa Rodriguez, whose investigation had initially uncovered the broader criminal network. Her testimony detailed the extensive electronic surveillance operation that had been monitoring my activities for months before the will reading, suggesting that the Whitman family had been preparing for potential inheritance challenges long before Robert Whitman's death was announced publicly. Rodriguez presented evidence that the surveillance had included illegal wiretapping of my phone communications, GPS tracking of my vehicle, and comprehensive monitoring of my internet activities and financial transactions. The surveillance reports contained intimate details about my personal relationships, work schedule, and daily routines that had been compiled over months of illegal monitoring and used to plan targeted harassment activities. The detective's testimony revealed that similar surveillance operations had been conducted against dozens of other individuals who posed potential threats to wealthy clients of these firms. The systematic nature of these activities demonstrated that illegal surveillance and harassment services had become routine business practices for a network of firms that specialized in helping wealthy clients avoid unfavorable legal outcomes. Agent Sarah Thompson followed with testimony about the federal investigation's discovery of the broader criminal network. Her presentation included organizational charts showing the relationships between various firms and their clients,
financial flowcharts demonstrating money laundering operations, and communication intercepts that revealed the coordination of harassment campaigns across multiple jurisdictions. Thompson's evidence included recorded conversations between Victoria Whitman and representatives of Blackwater Security Solutions in which she explicitly authorized illegal activities, including document theft, witness intimidation, and financial sabotage. The recordings captured Victoria discussing the need to neutralize
inheritance threat by any means necessary and authorizing substantial payments for services she clearly understood were illegal. The agent's testimony also revealed that Marcus Whitman had been the primary coordinator of the harassment campaign, serving as the liaison between the family and the various firms they had hired to conduct illegal activities. His communications included detailed instructions for creating false evidence of my mental instability and criminal associations that could be used to undermine my credibility in court proceedings. Julia Whitman's involvement was documented through her communications with public relations firms that had been hired to plant negative stories about me in local media outlets and social networks. Her emails included specific instructions for portraying me as an unstable gold digger and provided fabricated details about my supposed criminal background and history of manipulating older men for financial gain. The prosecution's presentation included testimony from Dr. Kevin Williams, a forensic accountant who had analyzed the complex financial transactions used to fund the harassment campaign. His analysis revealed that the Whitman family had spent over $400,000 on illegal services over a 3-month period, demonstrating both their desperation to prevent my inheritance and their willingness to invest substantial resources in criminal activities. Williams' testimony detailed the sophisticated money laundering operation that had been used to hide payments for illegal services. The scheme involved multiple layers of shell companies, offshore accounts, and seemingly legitimate consultant contracts that made it difficult to trace the true purpose of financial transactions while providing plausible deniability for clients who wanted to claim ignorance of specific tactics. The prosecution called several other victims of similar harassment campaigns who testified about their experiences with identical tactics employed by the same network of firms. Their testimony demonstrated the systematic nature of these operations and revealed that my case was just one example of a broader pattern of criminal activity that had been conducted over several years. Patricia Chen, a business executive who had been targeted after filing a wrongful termination lawsuit against a major corporation, described experiencing identical harassment tactics, including illegal surveillance, financial sabotage, and systematic destruction of personal and professional relationships. Her testimony showed that these firms used standardized procedures and tactics that had been refined through years of experience with similar cases. Robert Martinez, an inheritance claimant from a case 3 years earlier, testified about his experience with harassment that had ultimately forced him to abandon his legal claim and accept an unfavorable settlement. His testimony revealed that the firms involved had maintained detailed records of successful intimidation campaigns and used this experience to refine their tactics for maximum psychological impact. The prosecution presented evidence that these firms maintained extensive databases of personal information about potential targets and their associates, including detailed psychological profiles that could be used for future harassment campaigns. The databases represented massive violations of privacy laws and demonstrated the ongoing criminal nature of these enterprises. Foster's presentation included evidence of corruption within local law enforcement agencies, with recordings of conversations between firm representatives and police officers who had been paid to provide information about ongoing investigations and to minimize responses to criminal complaints filed by harassment victims. The corruption had enabled these firms to operate with impunity while ensuring their victims received minimal protection.
The prosecution also presented evidence of judicial influence operations, including campaign contributions and social pressure designed to influence court rulings in favor of these firms' clients. While direct corruption was difficult to prove, the patterns of favorable rulings in cases involving these firms were statistically improbable and suggested systematic influence that extended beyond normal legal advocacy. Chen's testimony about his own firm's experiences revealed that the harassment had extended to attempts to disrupt legal representation for victims. His law firm had experienced cyber attacks, client intimidation, and regulatory complaints that were all designed to prevent effective legal representation for people targeted by these criminal networks. The prosecution's evidence included internal communications from the firms involved that revealed detailed knowledge of the illegal nature of their activities. Company emails discussed the need to maintain plausible deniability while achieving desired outcomes through tactics that were explicitly acknowledged as criminal violations of federal law. Agent Thompson testified about the international connections of this criminal network, revealing that similar operations existed in multiple countries and shared information and tactics across national boundaries. The global scope of these activities indicated that harassment and intimidation services had become a substantial international business serving wealthy clients worldwide. The prosecution presented evidence that these firms had been involved in hundreds of similar cases over the previous 5 years, with success rates exceeding 60% in forcing targets to abandon their legal claims or accept unfavorable settlements. The statistical success demonstrated the effectiveness of these tactics and explained why wealthy clients were willing to pay premium prices for these illegal services. Foster's closing presentation included financial projections showing that this criminal network had generated tens of millions of dollars in revenue through illegal activities while causing hundreds of millions of dollars in damages to their victims. The scale of the criminal enterprise was staggering and demonstrated the need for severe penalties to deter similar activities in the future. Part 12. Emotional Reckoning. The moment when Victoria Whitman took the witness stand marked a profound emotional turning point in the proceedings and in my own journey towards understanding the depth of betrayal I had experienced. Her testimony, delivered under oath and cross-examination, revealed the calculating coldness behind the harassment campaign and stripped away any remaining illusions about the family dynamics that had shaped my father's secret decisions. Victoria's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she was forced to acknowledge her role in orchestrating the systematic destruction of my life and relationships. Under Prosecutor Foster's relentless questioning, she admitted to authorizing payments for services she knew were illegal, but
maintained that she had acted to protect her family's legitimate interests against what she still characterized as a fraudulent inheritance claim. Her testimony revealed the depth of her knowledge about the harassment campaign's specific tactics and objectives. She admitted to approving surveillance operations, document theft, and witness intimidation while attempting to justify these actions as necessary measures to expose what she claimed was my manipulation of her deceased husband. Her rationalizations demonstrated a complete disconnect from moral and legal reality. The most devastating moment came when Foster played recordings of Victoria's conversations with security firm representatives, in which she discussed escalating the harassment campaign if initial tactics proved unsuccessful. Her voice on the recordings was cold and businesslike, as she authorized activities that had caused me profound psychological trauma and had destroyed relationships that had taken years to build. Marcus Whitman's testimony followed, and his attempt to minimize his role in coordinating the criminal activities was systematically dismantled by the prosecution's evidence. His communications with various firms revealed extensive involvement in planning and directing harassment activities, while maintaining careful documentation of successful intimidation tactics that could be used in future cases. Under cross-examination, Marcus was forced to acknowledge that he had personally directed the surveillance operations against me and had provided detailed personal information that was used to plan targeted harassment activities.
His testimony revealed that he had viewed the campaign as a business problem, requiring systematic solution rather than recognizing the human cost of his actions. Julia Whitman's emotional breakdown on the witness stand provided stark contrast to her family members' calculated coldness. Her tears seemed genuine as she described the pressure she had felt to participate in activities she knew were wrong but had been convinced were necessary to protect the family's financial security and social position. Julia's testimony revealed the psychological manipulation that had been used within the family to justify their criminal activities. She described how her mother and brother had convinced her that I represented an existential threat to their way of life, and that extreme measures were necessary to prevent the destruction of everything their father had built. Grace's testimony as a prosecution witness was emotionally powerful and provided crucial evidence about the harassment campaign's impact on innocent bystanders. Her description of the systematic destruction of her community relationships and professional standing demonstrated the collateral damage caused by the criminal conspiracy, while highlighting the cruelty of tactics designed to isolate me from all sources of support. Grace's voice was strong and clear as she described the threats and intimidation she had experienced for supporting me throughout the ordeal. Her testimony revealed that the harassment had extended far beyond its primary target to include anyone who had provided assistance or encouragement, demonstrating the sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare employed by the criminal network. The emotional impact of hearing Grace describe the personal costs she had endured for supporting me was overwhelming and provided crucial insight into the broader implications of the harassment campaign. Her testimony revealed that the criminals had understood that destroying support relationships would be more effective than direct intimidation in achieving their objectives. My own testimony was the most emotionally challenging experience of the entire ordeal, requiring me to relive months of systematic harassment and intimidation while maintaining composure sufficient to provide clear and credible evidence. The prosecution had prepared me extensively for the emotional difficulty of testifying, but the actual experience of describing the psychological torture I had endured was more difficult than I had anticipated. Under Foster's gentle questioning, I described the escalating pattern of harassment that had systematically destroyed every aspect of my normal life, while creating constant fear and anxiety about my safety and future. The testimony required me to detail intimate aspects of the psychological trauma I had experienced, while maintaining focus on the factual evidence that would support criminal convictions. The defense's cross-examination attempted to portray me as an opportunistic gold digger who had somehow orchestrated the entire situation for financial gain, but their arguments were undermined by the extensive evidence of criminal conspiracy and the obvious impossibility of my having manufactured such elaborate criminal activities. Their desperation was evident in their increasingly implausible theories about my supposed manipulation of the evidence. The emotional reckoning extended beyond the courtroom, as I was forced to confront the reality that my father had known about the harassment I would face and had still chosen to structure his will in a way that would expose me to these dangers. His decision to acknowledge me as his heir, while failing to protect me from the predictable family reaction, represented a complex moral legacy that I would need to process for years. The testimony of other harassment victims demonstrated the extent of the criminal network I had been confronting and demonstrated the systematic nature of the harassment campaign. On the court day, the convictions were read, and Victoria, Marcus, and Henry Hampton were sentenced to prison. Justice had been served, and the nightmare of a lifetime had ended.
Victims provided important context for understanding that my experience was part of a broader pattern of criminal activity rather than an isolated family dispute. Their descriptions of similar tactics and psychological trauma helped me understand that the specific cruelties I had endured were calculated business strategies rather than personal attacks based on my individual characteristics.
Dr. Amanda Foster, a clinical psychologist who specialized in trauma counseling, testified about the psychological impact of systematic harassment campaigns and the long-term effects of the type of sustained intimidation I had experienced. Her testimony provided scientific context for understanding the emotional damage caused by these criminal activities while offering hope for recovery and healing. The psychological evaluation process had been difficult, but necessary for documenting the mental health impact of the harassment campaign. Dr. Foster's testimony revealed that I had developed symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of the sustained campaign of intimidation and psychological warfare directed against me. Her testimony also addressed the broader implications of these types of criminal campaigns for their victims and communities. The systematic destruction of trust, relationships, and social connections caused damage that extended far beyond individual victims to include family members, friends, and entire communities that were manipulated and deceived by sophisticated disinformation campaigns. The emotional processing of the betrayal by people I had served and respected at the hotel was particularly difficult and required extensive therapeutic work to address feelings of shame and self-doubt that had been deliberately cultivated by the harassment campaign. Understanding that their changed behavior had been influenced by systematic manipulation helped reduce self-blame, but couldn't eliminate the hurt caused by their rejection. The realization that my father had been watching my life from a distance for years while never making contact raised complex emotions about his motivations and the choices he had made. His financial support had been meaningful and had made important differences in my life, but his decision to remain distant had denied me the relationship I had always craved, while leaving me unprepared for the challenges his acknowledgement would create. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.